All right, there we go. Okay, there you go, Reina.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, my name is Reina Tyl, here to talk about ruffed grouse and American woodcock in Pennsylvania, which it's my understanding that this group is a lot of folks in West Virginia, but maybe also southwestern Pennsylvania. So I tried to keep the Pennsylvania stuff a little bit light, but that is where I work. So it's going to be pretty focused on the state of Pennsylvania. So ruffed grouse are the most widely distributed resident game bird in North America. So very closely related to other ground-dwelling birds like turkeys, other species of grouse, pheasants, all of the galliforms. That's the order that they're in, and then they're in the family of Phasianidae, which has pheasants and turkeys and everything else. But they are the only member of the Bonasa genus in North America. And they are a bird, obviously, but they prefer walking to flying. So they spend pretty much all of their time on the ground unless they're trying to get away from a predator or get away from us or fly up into a tree to eat. They have cryptic coloration. So
I don't think you sprung
most
us.
of the time
We love them.
you love them. Yeah. Yeah, they are also, I guess, an honorary mention. They are the state bird of Pennsylvania, so very cool to be the one responsible for, overseeing management of our state bird in Pennsylvania. And because of that, they are well known by both, grouse hunters, but also just the everyday person in Pennsylvania, which is not the case for grouse in other states I've found. So they have cryptic coloration. They're built to blend in. They blend in very well with the ground. For the most part, you'll only see them if they're flying away from you, or if or you'll hear them. So you might hear some of the other calls they make, but their popular drumming display in the springtime is, for the most part, how they make themselves known to us. They have a short triangular feather crest on their head. They have a black or brown, sometimes ruff around their neck. That's where they get their name, is those rough feathers that surround their neck that the males sometimes puff out during their display period. Something that I found is not as well known is the females do have those as well, but a lot of times they're hidden under some of their, kind of regular brownish cryptic feathers. So you can't always see them when they're laid down on their neck. They also have a very characteristic fan-shaped tail, and the fan is something that can help you distinguish the sex of the bird. So males usually, or I guess not usually, but if a bird has a solid black band around their tail, it's a male. Some males don't have a solid black band that might be broken up in the middle. Females have that characteristic as well. Another important distinguishing feature is that females have shorter tails than males. So if the bird overall from a distance, if you can see it and it looks I guess a little bit more short and kind of round and less elongated, there's a good likelihood that that's a female grouse instead of a male grouse. And then they also have short legs that do this fun thing in the wintertime where they grow these comb-like projections on the sides of their toes to kind of increase surface area. And the thought is that helps them walk on top of the snow like snowshoes. Another really important thing to think about when it comes to grouse is that they are an early successional forest habitat specialist. They thrive in high stem density young forests. This really dense cover provides them protection from predators. Their main predators of which are other birds. So your raptors are the grouse's main predator. Other times of the year, they might be more susceptible to mammalian predation, like during nesting and brood rearing, but for the most part, they're seeking protection from other birds. They are relatively short-lived, 2 to 3 years is, I guess, kind of an average lifespan. There's always outliers, but 3 years old is definitely an old grouse. But they have high reproductive potential. So what really drives their population numbers is the production of new individuals and then also late winter survival. So the range of grouse in North America, for most of it, overlaps the range of aspen trees, which is a very important food source for grouse throughout a lot of that range. In those regions, they also exhibit 10-year cycles. So you may be familiar with this concept when it comes to like lynx and snowshoe hare and those population dynamics and how they cycle with each other. Grouse exhibit a very similar phenomenon up in these regions. And most of the information that we know about grouse comes from these areas. Of course, it's like southern Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and the other southern Appalachian part of their range falls outside of this aspen zone. We do get, patches of aspen, of course, in some places, but for the most part, down in southern PA and in West Virginia, you're going to have more oak hickory, mixed music forests, and not aspen. And so it's kind of a unique place to think about ruffed grouse ecology, especially compared to the majority of their range. Fortunately, there was a really great study that was conducted in the late 90s and early 2000s in this southern periphery of their range, as we call it sometimes. So grouse in this region have always existed in lower densities than in the more northern portions of their range. And they also haven't exhibited those typical 10-year cycles that you observe in those other regions as well. And so we know their ecology here to be a little bit different than what it is in other parts of their range. So I'm going to try to, when I present information about like what they're eating and things like that, I'm really kind of trying to focus on, and also, their movements, like their home range. I'm focusing on research that's come out of this study. You'll find a bunch of different figures to describe how far they move and all of that stuff. But again, it comes from areas that maybe aren't as similar to this part of the country. Another important thing to think about with this study is that it occurred prior to the introduction of West Nile virus into the US for the most part. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So a lot of the information from this study is still relevant today, but when we think about, annual survival metrics and production metrics, it's possible that those things may have changed in the last couple of decades due to the presence of that disease on the landscape. So I'm going to go through what grouse do throughout the year, starting in the springtime. So in the springtime, this is their peak displaying period. So the males conduct a very conspicuous drumming display to delineate their territories and attract females. If you haven't heard it, I describe the sound as kind of like a basketball bouncing on the ground. It changes in cadence like that too. If you were to drop a basketball, just kind of let it dribble its way to the ground. And that sound doesn't, actually come out of their mouth as a vocalization. It is produced by really quickly beating their wings back and forth to create an air vacuum. And the process of that air being sucked into that vacuum is what creates the sound. So if you've been lucky enough to hear it, you'll probably notice that you feel it sometimes more than you actually hear it with your ears. It's really low frequency, so it can be hard to hear. But it's like a subwoofer boom. So you do feel that kind of air motion. It's very cool. So they like to do their drumming in dense young forest, usually 5 to 15 years after disturbance, that has coarse woody debris in it. So downed logs or old stumps, something that they can prop themselves up on so that they're visible to other grouse within the stand, but also that they're protected overhead from any predators because they are making themselves vulnerable while they're conducting this display. So then the males will breed the females, and then their job is done. They just go back to delineating their territory, enjoying their summertime, and the females get to work doing all the hard stuff, which is laying eggs and incubating their eggs, which they do in depressions on the ground. So that leaves them very vulnerable. They like to nest next to trees, under logs, something that provides them with protection from predators. So if they nest backed up against a tree, they can keep their eyes forward and hopefully, are protected from behind. Or if they nest under a log, that allows them to see out both sides of that log. And if they see a predator coming from one side, they can escape out the other side. Something that's a little bit unique about grouse, or not unique about grouse, but interesting about grouse that people don't think about, is we do associate them with those young early successional forests, but a lot of the nest laying that they do is actually in more mature forest types. So a more open understory that allows the female to be able to see oncoming threats. again, with that coarse woody debris component, so they have somewhere to stash their nest. So a lot of times they might nest in a more open, mature forest that's adjacent to a young forest patch that hopefully once their eggs hatch, they can then go into that dense cover with their young to seek that protection of the young forest. And then grouse will change what they're eating throughout the year based on what's available. By springtime, there's lots of tree buds that are available to them. They'll start eating young, green, tender vegetation as that becomes available. Then during the summertime, this is when grouse are, rearing their young. So females will be often seen in groups with other females with their young. Sometimes when the young get large enough, it can be really hard to discern them from the hen. So you'll just see a group of 6 grouse together, and most likely that is a hen with her young from that year. They're young are precocial, so once they hatch, they're pretty much ready to move within a day or two out of the nest and start feeding right away. And during this time period, insect food source is really important for those young. So she'll take her brood to an area that has, an abundance of forbs and young green vegetation, places where insects will be, so those chicks can feed and grow as quickly as possible. So the faster they grow, the sooner they'll be able to fly and the better they'll be able to avoid predators. So it's really important for them to have a lot of protein for that rapid growth when they're young. And then adults will kind of eat a broader diet. So they'll eat insects as well, but they'll also eat, leaves and seeds from herbaceous vegetation. They'll also eat soft mast as it becomes available. So as you get your blackberries and raspberries and things like that during the summertime, grouse will take advantage of all of those food sources. And those brambles provide really good cover for young grouse as well. If you don't like walking through thick brambles, neither do the things that want to eat grouse. So during the fall season, this is when those young of the year start to break away from their brood. So males will often break away first, followed by the females, but females tend to disperse further than males. And then they'll continue to eat those soft mass sources as available. So think of like your grapevines, greenbrier, things like that. They'll also eat, buds that are available and acorns as they become available as well. If an acorn's small enough to fit in a grouse's mouth, it will eat it. Some of the big white oak acorns are sometimes a little bit too large for them. It just depends on the species. Something that's unique about our Southern Appalachian or our Appalachian grouse compared to grouse in other parts of their range is that their diets tend to be a lot higher in tannin and phenol levels, just because they're not relying so much on aspen tree food sources and some of those more northern tree species, and more on oaks and things like that. They tend to consume more of those. So just kind of a unique thing that they found during that study about grouse diets in this part of North America. So during the wintertime, natal dispersal will continue. The males, sometimes it can take them, even though they don't disperse as far, they have to find an unoccupied territory. So they might continue to wander around, trying to find a suitable breeding habitat that's not occupied already by an adult male. So it can take them a little bit longer to settle down. Their movements during the wintertime are also really dictated by where available food is and where they have cover. So again, kind of in this more southern portion of their range, occasionally we'll get snow conditions that are right so that they can roost in the snowpack. So they'll actually bury themselves in the snow to stay warm and stay hidden from predators throughout a lot of their range. But more recently, our snow cover has not been as reliable, or it'll be wet, really dense snow that it's just not suitable conditions for them. So they rely a lot on young conifers or evergreen species for cover during the wintertime. So, young spruce stands, rhododendron patches, laurel patches, anything that can keep them shielded from winter weather conditions and maybe keep the ground open and clear of snow at ground level just to provide them with a warmer place to hang out. And then, of course, winter is when food starts to become a little bit more of a problem as the winter continues. So they'll continue eating any mast that they can find that's still available. They'll also resort to eating evergreen ferns, so things like Christmas tree fern that are green all year round. They'll eat those as well, but obviously, the nutritional contents of those food sources sometimes vary. So by the end of winter, before those buds really start popping on the trees, that's when food is most limiting for grouse, and that's also a time of year where we can see a good amount of mortality related to lack of food, harsh winter conditions. And obviously, if they're having to move around a lot to find food, if their movements have to increase, they're more vulnerable to predation. So that can be a factor as well. So something that's really important to think about when it comes to grouse is how they exist on the landscape. They are resident game birds, so they live in the same place all year round. They're not migrating. They really only make one big movement in their lifetime. So that's that juvenile dispersal. Their first fall and winter after hatching is the most that they will move distance-wise in their life. Otherwise, they settle into a home range, which for males tends to be a little bit smaller. Females tends to be a little bit larger. If you think about, all the different things that females have to do throughout the year as far as meeting the males where they are in the springtime and then finding suitable nesting cover and suitable brood rearing cover. They just might have to cover more ground to have all of those things. But for the most part, we're talking about less than 100 acres of space is where that grouse is going to spend its life. And so as a manager and when we're working on habitat projects and thinking about how we're orienting habitat treatments on the landscape, we have to really think about that distance component. How far are these treatments from each other? Is it reasonable that a grouse could disperse to use this cover in a year or in 2 years? Just thinking about the location of those habitat patches is really important as far as considering how useful they'll be to grouse within a relatively short time period. And so in Pennsylvania, with grouse being a resident game bird species, their management is really dictated by each individual state. There's no federal oversight saying, what data you have to collect on these species. So as far as the monitoring data that states have to try to determine what their grouse population is doing, it can vary a lot depending on where you are. In Pennsylvania, we have a few different surveys that we use to try to glean information about the status of our grouse population. And they also sometimes operate at different levels. So we have drumming surveys that we conduct in the springtime, but these are really used to try to look at response to habitat treatments. So if we're doing a habitat project in an area and we want to see if that grouse population is improving, we might do surveys before the treatment and after the treatment to try to figure out if we were successful in creating habitat that resulted in more grouse in that area. But it's really a kind of a fine scale tool. Some of our broader scale tools that we use to measure grouse at the statewide level or at regional levels within the state are our summer sighting survey, which is a survey that our field staff, like our foresters, folks that are out on our state game lands every day conducting work, they will record the number of days that they spend working outside and then the number of grouse that they observe. They'll also record the number of hens and chicks. And all that information allows us to create an index of grouse observed per day afield. And from year to year, if people are seeing more grouse per day, then we can assume that their numbers have increased. If they're seeing fewer grouse per day, we can say that their numbers have declined. And we can use that information to figure out trends in, grouse abundance during the summer months through time. We also have our Hunter Cooperator Survey. So this is a program that a few different states in the eastern range of grouse have. Basically, they have a list of grouse hunters that go out every fall pursuing the species, and they will record information on the number of hours they spend afield and how many grouse they encounter. They may also record information about how many grouse they harvest and other metrics, but for the most part, we use that encounter-based information. So we calculate grouse flushes per hour hunted. And again, in theory, if there are more grouse on the landscape, hunters will be able to encounter more grouse per hour. And if there's fewer grouse, we can see that encounter rate go down. And that's the main metric that we use to monitor grouse populations in Pennsylvania. We've been collecting that data since the early 1960s. And then we also have a game take survey. And this is just kind of a general survey of hunters in Pennsylvania that's sent out to a stratified random sample of all hunting license holders each year. Unfortunately, as the number of small game hunters has declined, including grouse hunters, we don't pick up very many hunters with this survey. And so the numbers and the estimates that we get from that data have a lot of error around them and are no longer really serving much of a purpose. So it's something that we've used in the past to try to estimate, hunter numbers, harvest numbers and things like that, but the level of confidence we have in those estimates has really gone down. One thing that holds true is that our grouse hunter numbers have been declining, our harvest numbers have been declining through time. So as far as across jurisdictions, this is something that I do have I guess a cooperative group where other grouse biologists in states in the East, we get together and we talk about issues that we're facing with grouse in our states, and we're working on more coordinated across state management. And so we've started looking at tools that we can use that already exist that might help us to determine grouse population trends across broader regions. And three of those things that we've really looked at recently are things that you are probably familiar with. So eBird, of course, lots of data on there about grouse sightings, the breeding bird survey, and then the Christmas bird count. And actually, we took it a step further recently. We're working on publishing a manuscript where we tried to see, because that fall flush rate from our hunters is kind of the gold standard of what's been used in the past. We tried to see if any of these surveys, mimic the trends that we have in that hunter data. There are states, so Pennsylvania is still sitting pretty good. We have quite a few hunter cooperators that still submit data to us, but states further south in their range, so like Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and even West Virginia in some cases, hunter numbers have declined to a point where the amount of people sending in data is so low that they can't really get reliable estimates of flushes per hour in the fall. And so we found that the Christmas bird count actually is a really good proxy for that data that we've been collecting. It makes sense because the Christmas bird count happens around the same time that those hunters are out during the fall season. But that's something that I'm hoping to incorporate into my program in the future is using Christmas bird count data to help me track grouse trends in Pennsylvania, but also potentially across the Eastern region to guide management. So something I'm looking to change moving forward. And it's probably not a big surprise to folks that have been that are tuned into things going on with grouse, but in the East here, their numbers have been in decline for a while now. We've kind of got this long-term declining trend is indicated by two of our longest running surveys here in Pennsylvania. But we also have noticed that recently we've seen an even more pronounced decline since the turn of the 21st century. And we haven't really seen the recovery the way that we would in the past. We'd see declines and then some level of recovery. And so that got, us kind of thinking about what's going on here. And I guess I stole this from Lisa. So we were talking earlier about my predecessor, Lisa Williams, and she had this really awesome slide where she said there's the kills you slowly and the kills you quickly. And basically the kills you slowly is related to habitat and the kills you quickly is related to disease. And I'll get into those two things right now. So in Pennsylvania and most of the Eastern US, we've seen this long-term declining trend in the amount of seedling and sapling aged forests. So those young forest stands that are really dense that grouse and other early successional species rely on. And so, with that decline in their preferred habitat type, we have noticed a decline in their numbers as well. And so the resulting landscape throughout much of Pennsylvania right now, you're either dealing with a situation where you have, you know, a mature forest with a very open understory. Where would a grouse hide in that picture on the right? They would just be out in the open, ready for the picking by any of their, you know, preferred predators or unpreferred predators. And then you have a situation where whatever's not this mature forest is open land. So it might be agricultural land, pastures, development. A lot of Pennsylvania has a two-toned nature of second growth mature forest or non-forest. And so that's really put grouse in a hard place. And then, of course, in the early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s, we had the introduction of West Nile virus into the United States. And so this was something that a lot of you probably remember. I know I do. Growing up in Michigan, I just remember having a bunch of dead crows in our yard, dead blue jays. Those were the most visibly affected because they lived close to us. So people would find these dead species and go, okay, wow, this disease is clearly affecting these species. But for something like grouse that lives in the forest and isn't really easy to see, the effect that this disease was having on grouse was not noticed right away. So my predecessor, Lisa, really started thinking, when she got into the role, I think around 2011, a lot of hunters would approach her and say, you know, these areas where we have really good habitat, we're just not seeing the grouse that we used to. And so if it's not a habitat problem, then clearly something else had to be going on here. So she looked at the trends of the data and started to wonder, you know, she saw that declining trend about the same time that West Nile virus entered the US, started to wonder if there was a link. And that led to a study where they hatched grouse eggs in captivity and inoculated some of them with the virus and tried to see how they responded. And what they found was that 70 to 90% of the infected grouse were unlikely to survive infection. So they either had really gross lesions on their internal organs that ultimately would have killed them, or they did die from the disease in captivity. And so it really set the stage that this is a disease that can potentially impact grouse greatly at the individual level, but then of course scale it up to the population level. And so we then were like, okay, we need to have a better understanding of West Nile virus in Pennsylvania. And so it started as a human risk monitoring thing. So the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection was conducting mosquito trapping in order to look at West Nile virus across Pennsylvania and from a human health standpoint. But they had this really awesome data set that we were able to use to also look at how bad the disease was from year to year and relate that to grouse. And so what we saw was that when we would see a really severe West Nile virus year, we would often see a response in our grouse population indices. So we would see a corresponding decline in grouse numbers based on these metrics that we were tracking. A couple of different species appeared to be the main culprits, but we really aimed to try to figure out, obviously with the disease, you can't just wave a magic wand and there's no magical solution to that, except for maybe some crazy bioengineering solutions. But beyond anything really practical right away, we really were thinking, how do we mitigate the effects of this disease on grouse? Is there a way that where is this disease on the landscape? Could we focus on putting grouse habitat in places where they're less likely to encounter West Nile virus carrying mosquitoes? And so we did a lot of mosquito trapping research to try to figure out the landscape epidemiology of mosquitoes that are the main vectors of this disease. And so what we found was that the species richness and the number of mosquitoes carrying this virus it would decline as you'd go up in elevation. So at these higher elevational limits, we would see fewer mosquitoes and little to no prevalence of West Nile virus. Also slope and soil drainage. So areas that were less well drained, where you would get pools of water, intermittent pools of water that mosquitoes could lay their eggs in. in those areas, we would often see higher prevalence of the disease. And I just want to be clear, when we talk about these water sources where we're finding mosquitoes, we're not talking about natural wetlands or rivers or streams, because those all have natural predator populations in them. They'll have other predatory insects like dragonfly larvae, maybe small fish, things like that that will eat mosquito larvae. What we're really talking about are these intermittent sources like ruts in a road that hold water for a little bit of time and then dry up. People in their backyard, if you have any containers that hold water, bird baths, things like that, those are really good sources or really good places for mosquitoes to lay their eggs, because there's no predators there to eat their larvae. So based on all this information we learned about where the disease is most likely to exist on our landscape, we developed this tool called the Grouse Priority Area Sighting Tool. It's basically a West Nile virus risk map. So the areas in purple have the least risk based on elevation and soil drainage. Areas in white have the highest risk. And so something, you'll notice there's a pretty good chunk through like the Laurel Highlands region of southern PA there that is considered a low risk area for the disease. And this has been really good because it helps our foresters and our land managers who want to do habitat projects with grouse in mind be able to plan those projects and execute them in a place where we can expect the impact to grouse, or we can expect the grouse response to be high. So avoiding putting projects in areas that it's likely they're going to encounter this disease, and any positive impacts of that habitat improvement could be washed out by the fact that there's just a lot of disease in that area. So that was kind of the thinking behind this. So we use it in the Game Commission. Our partners in DCNR will use this tool when planning projects on state forests. Private landowners will use it as well. It's become a really good tool to help people plan out where they want to work. And so, in addition to all this research about West Nile virus and how that's affected our, monitoring of grouse population factors that affect them, and grouse populations themselves, we do research periodically when we're trying to just get a better picture of what's going on with grouse in PA and use that information to inform our management. And something that we did recently, I guess we're still working on with Penn State University, is a genetic study of grouse in Pennsylvania. The thinking was that we've seen these really dramatic declines, and we were wondering, do we still have a healthy grouse population from a genetic standpoint? Is there still good genetic diversity and connectivity? Or have we experienced, a decline that has led to the population breaking off into subpopulations? Are those subpopulations small and at risk of dying out and being extirpated in certain places? Are they experiencing inbreeding? Just all of these questions, sometimes more complicated genetic questions than I even really fully understand, but just trying to figure out what's going on with grouse. We also thought we would look at, if we're seeing any signs to any sort of selection related to West Nile virus resistance. It's, 2 decades of West Nile virus seems like a long time, but evolutionarily speaking, it's not very long. But we were just wondering if maybe we're starting to see that the grouse that we have now are maybe becoming more resistant through time, just because the survivors are the ones that are able to breed and pass on their genes. And so the good news is we found that we don't have any subpopulations of grouse in PA. It's still one contiguous population, but we did find that in our more like southern regions of Pennsylvania, where there's more habitat fragmentation and more development and things like that, the grouse aren't doing as well connectivity wise as they are in our more northern regions of the state, where the habitat is more connected. And so that's something that we're looking into with a study like this, where we just looked at Pennsylvania. It's hard to know if the numbers we found are good or bad. So the next phase of this project is looking at genetics across the range of grouse in the east. So we have samples from Maine down through Georgia, where we're going to be looking at the genetics in those areas. and comparing what we found in Pennsylvania to try to figure out if the levels we're seeing are good or bad, relatively speaking, compared to a population of grouse in Maine that's doing really well, and a population of grouse in Georgia that could be considered to be doing worse than grouse in PA. While we were doing this genetics investigation, we did come across a unique, unexpected result. So we found a genetic anomaly that was that we couldn't explain by any of the characteristics that were known about the grouse that we investigated. So basically, there was two groups of grouse, two very unique groups of grouse. They're the purple and the yellow dots on your screen. But we couldn't correlate those two categories to the sex of the bird, their color phase, so whether they were like a gray phase or a red phase, or their location. Obviously, as you can see by the map, those yellow individuals are pretty well spread out across the state. So we started racking our brains about chromosomal inversions in other wildlife populations and how those have manifested as different traits. And a lot of times it can be a physiological change, so maybe a slightly different plumage color. It can result in different breeding systems in one population, and then those that have the inversion, a chromosomal inversion, might have a different breeding system. So there's different ways this can manifest, and another one of those ways is behavior. And so obviously, grouse are known to, some grouse are known to exhibit this strange behavior that we often call like tame grouse behavior, where they appear to be not afraid of people or sometimes hyper aggressive towards people. Those feel like two different things, but people relate them as the same thing. And so we started to wonder if this behavioral difference that some grouse exhibit could be what we're seeing here, or this inversion could be causing this difference. So I had the distinct pleasure of, we put out a press release to the public just saying, hey, if you know where one of these things is, let us know. We'd love to come catch it and get a DNA sample. And then I spent a pretty good amount of my time this past spring, and I guess even into summer, traveling across Pennsylvania to try to encounter these individuals and capture them, and take a genetic sample, which we basically did a mouth swab, like you would do if you were doing a DNA test on your dog or yourself, like send it off to 23andMe or whatever. And so we're still in the process of analyzing those results, but I don't know, it'll be interesting to see if we do find a link between this behavior and that weird genetic anomaly that we found. And so now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about American woodcock. Let me look at the time that I've got. Okay, 15 minutes. I'll try to do it really quick. So something that I like about my job is I have the resident game bird species, but then I also get to manage a migratory upland game bird species. They're an upland game bird species, but as a lot of you probably know, woodcock are in the same group as shorebirds and sandpipers. For some reason, they just like to spend their time upland and not at the beach. And so Pennsylvania is in the breeding range for woodcock, so is West Virginia, but they also use a lot of sites in Pennsylvania and West Virginia as migratory stopover locations. They also are cryptically colored. They're made to blend into the ground. They have a short neck and tail and a long straight bill that they use to probe into the ground to find food. Something that's fairly unique about woodcock is that their eyes are so high and far back on their head that their ear is actually located more towards the ground. So in that picture, I've got an arrow pointing to where their ear is in relation to their eye and their bill. So just kind of a weird ear placement, but their eyes are so far up on their head so that as they're probing in the ground looking for food, they can keep their eyes to the sky and see if any predators are coming their way. And the thought also is with their ear being pointed towards the ground, it might also help them detect, worms and things moving around in the ground for food. So like grouse, woodcock are an early successional habitat specialist. They need that overhead concealment of really dense vegetation, but they need the openness at ground level. So they need bare ground at ground level, because even though they spend a lot of their time on the ground, they are not very good walkers. They're a little bit like clumsy and tipsy. And so having that openness at ground level helps them navigate. They can't really navigate through dense vegetation well. Think of like your mat grasses like fescue. But they also need that openness so that it helps them locate food. Woodcock as well, they will spend their daytime in different covers where they might spend their nighttime. So sometimes they'll fly up to a mile from where they roost each night to where they spend their daytime, and vice versa. Like grouse as well, woodcock perform a conspicuous mating display in the springtime called the sky dance, where males will fly up into the air and then kind of float back down, doing this dance to attract females in the springtime. So again, once the males breed females, they're done with their job. The females take over. They have relatively low reproductive output, so they only lay 4 eggs, but they have relatively high survival, so they'll live for several years at a time. And again, their young is precocial, so they're pretty much ready to leave the nest as soon as they hatch. But the mom will have to feed them for the first few days, and then the young will be able to feed on their own about 3 to 4 days after hatch. And the little young woodcock puffballs with their long gangly legs are just adorable. So hopefully you get to see some if you haven't seen them before. So woodcock, even though grouse are, in some ways a poster child of early successional habitat, I feel like woodcock really are the poster child of early successional habitat because they will start using it from year 0 after disturbance, all the way up until about 20 years, 25 years. Once it gets older than that, it's no longer that useful to them. So that earliest level of succession where you kind of got basically just grasses and open space, they'll use those areas as singing grounds, displaying areas, or for roosting habitat. So another weird thing about woodcock, when we think of roosting, at least I think of a bird sitting up in a tree or roosting up off the ground. If you have chickens, they might roost in their coop, but woodcock roost on the ground in the middle of an open field. I guess just being in that open space and being able to see predators coming is their form of security. So it feels a little counterintuitive, but that's where they roost. Once you start to get that dense vegetation that provides them with good overhead cover, they'll use those areas for feeding. Especially if they're, those moist soil areas that have earthworms, they'll use for feeding. If it's a little bit drier, but still has that thick cover, they'll use those areas more for nesting. And then pretty much any place they would use for normal feeding habitat, they will use for brood rearing as well. So again, that dense cover is really important for keeping them protected. So here's a couple examples of what that might look like. You can see in that top picture that really dense viburnum patch of thick woody veg is something that a woodcock might be in to try to be probing around in there for food, but feel very protected. They tend to hang out on areas that aren't very sloped. So slopes less than 15%. These also tend to be areas that have the soil conditions that woodcock look for when they're foraging for food. And other things that you can look for when you're trying to figure out if an area is good for woodcock or not is certain indicator species. So vegetation species, things like goldenrod, dogwoods, alders, willow, those sorts of species are associated with the same soils that woodcock need to find food. Now, of course, these open areas are really easily colonized by invasive species, so it can be kind of tricky because you might come up on an area that's full of autumn olive and multiflora rose, and it might be hard to determine just based on the vegetation that's present that it's suitable for woodcock. But it might be a suitable site that unfortunately has just been taken over by invasive plants. So yeah, things that differ, when it comes to woodcock and grouse is how they use the landscape. Grouse like to walk, so they'll walk between habitat patches, which means they don't move very far. But woodcock obviously fly. They're migratory. They make diurnal movement, or they move from their diurnal patches to their roosting sites at nighttime. And so because of that, they can locate suitable habitat, as soon as you create it, they can colonize it that next year immediately because they can find it. But also they'll use patches from year zero. So those open spaces right after treatment serve one purpose. And then as that succeeds into, you know, denser vegetation and then all the way up into young forest, they'll be able to continue using that habitat type for 20 or so years. But then of course they need that disturbance again to set it back to year zero. And so again, just because they are, you know, a migratory species, their management is overseen by the federal government, and there are several coordinated surveys that they conduct to gather information on woodcock populations. So one of them is the Singing Ground Survey. There's basically a group of volunteers of people that go out, well, volunteers and staff. In the Game Commission, a lot of our game wardens conduct these surveys, but they'll go out to known routes that are run every year to listen for painting, displaying woodcock during the springtime. And they'll be able to determine the number of singing males that they hear per route through time. So each year to figure out if populations are declining or increasing. There's also the parts collection survey. So hunters that harvest woodcock, some of them are sent envelopes that they can mail in one wing from their woodcock, and then biologists like myself will get together in the springtime and we will age and sex all those wings. And from that information, we can look at the number of juveniles or the ratio of juveniles in the harvest to adult females in the harvest. And that can allow us to determine approximately what recruitment was like that year. So how many new woodcock were produced that year. And then the harvest information program, it's kind of similar to what we do in the Game Commission, where we survey our hunters to figure out how much they were hunting, how many woodcock they harvested, things like that. But it's conducted at the federal level. So they can use that to estimate woodcock harvests in each state, each hunting season, and look at those trends through time. And then in Pennsylvania, we have our own surveys that we conduct. We have a woodcock cooperator survey that's very similar to our grouse one. In fact, it's the same mailing list. So as people are, you know, hunting for woodcock, they can record the number of hours spent afield, the number of woodcock they encountered, and I can use that information to track populations through time. We have our own Singing Ground surveys that we conduct, kind of like our grouse drumming surveys when we're trying to look at woodcock response to habitat treatments. So like that finer scale management, and then that game take survey, like I mentioned. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages woodcock as two populations. So there's the central population, which matches up with like the Mississippi flyway. And then there's the eastern region that matches up with the Atlantic flyway. Pennsylvania and West Virginia are in that eastern region. And this is the scale at which they make their regulatory decisions. So when they set, you know, seasons, season dates and bag limits and things, they're made at those region levels because they are migratory. So it wouldn't make sense for, you know, us in Pennsylvania to have completely different rules as someone down in Virginia. And so, unfortunately, like grouse, there's been this long-term declining trend in woodcock populations across the continent and the eastern region, and also in Pennsylvania. A lot of it as a result of, you know, habitat loss and degradation. I will say the good news is, I haven't looked at the exact trend for West Virginia, but in Pennsylvania, we've been seeing a non-significant increasing trend for the last, I don't know, 10 years. So that tells me that in the last 10 years, our woodcock population has actually been more stable. It looks like, according to that map, West Virginia is a non-significant decreasing trend, which again would indicate relative stability in woodcock numbers over the last 10 years in West Virginia, which is good news. We always like to see increasing numbers of the things that we like, but not getting worse is good too. But like I said, you know, that big long-term trend of decline can be, you know, really pinpointed down to loss of young forests, early successional habitats, conversion of, you know, shrublands and meadows, which are good woodcock habitats, into agriculture and residential development. So those more open landscapes like shrublands are easier to turn into something else. And so those often tend to be the first to go. Obviously, degradation of habitats due to invasive plants. We see a lot of that in Pennsylvania, and especially in my part of the state. I live in the Cumberland Valley, kind of west of Harrisburg. Lots of invasive plants. And also the loss and suppression of natural processes that historically would have maintained their habitats. So think about beavers creating wetland habitats that, you know, would create a suitable environment for woodcock surrounding those habitats. And like grouse, we developed a tool to help us plan out where we do habitat projects in Pennsylvania based on, you know, what makes sense from a woodcock land use standpoint. So basically use some different variables about land cover and land use, topography, soil moisture. So like I mentioned, they don't like to be on very sloped areas. They don't want to be in dry soil, well-drained areas. And so we can use this map to plan out where our habitat projects are most likely to benefit woodcock. And we can also toggle that for their needs during migration versus their needs during the breeding season. So we might have an area that is a good breeding site, but maybe doesn't see much use during migratory stopover season. Whereas we might have a site that's a really important migratory stopover site. We want to manage it for a good feeding area, but we don't necessarily need to focus on managing it for a good nesting area. And so, like everything, we're still learning. There's this really awesome project that's led by the University of Maine called the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative. There are other folks involved in that now. So I think they're collaborating with some folks at SUNY ESF. West Virginia has a woodcock project that they started looking at, I believe it's spring or breeding season habitat use of woodcock in the state. And so we've learned a lot already from this effort, and we're learning things all together. So I just have a couple of highlights there of things that we've learned. So we learned that in Pennsylvania, our fall migration peaks in late October, early November. I suspect West Virginia is similar, maybe a little bit later than that. The singing ground survey, so what the federal government uses or what the feds use to track population numbers. There's always been questions about the timing of those surveys and are we capturing woodcock after they've already settled into their breeding areas and are no longer migrating? And what we found is that, yeah, for the most part, that survey does a really good job of only capturing woodcock once they've settled down into their breeding areas. We don't want to be double counting woodcock. So counting them in multiple surveys as they do their migration. So that was a really good finding from this research as well. And one of the more interesting ones that I thought was, I guess we thought that woodcock would migrate and then they would breed and then that's it. But what we found is that females actually mix their migratory movements with nesting attempts. So they might make a migratory movement, find a male, breed with them, lay a nest. If they're not successful, they'll migrate again further north and try again. And they'll basically keep doing that until they're successful. And they found that one female had 6 nest attempts that she made migratory movements in between each nest attempt, going further and further north every time. But anyway, so they almost maybe have this itinerant breeding strategy that we would not have known about if we weren't able to slap GPS transmitters on these little birds. So very interesting stuff. And I'm excited to see what we learn because it's only going to help us further refine our management. So anyways, that's all I have. I know it's a lot of information, but I think we do have a few minutes. Oh, no, it's right 8 o'clock. But if you guys want to ask me questions, I'll stick around and answer questions.
Hi, Reina. That was really great. I mean, 2 birds that I think all of us love. So I think if somebody has a question, they can type it in the chat. And can you see the chat?
Yep.
Okay. So you got a great presentation in the chat.
And I know it's a lot of stuff. I always I think get a little overzealous with how much time I think I have and how much I can fit in.
Well, it's a lot of good information, and they're 2 really great birds. Actually, I have a question. Do the male grouse drum in the morning like songbirds sing in the morning?
Yeah, I guess I
Is there a
forgot to
time of
mention that.
day? Is there a
Yeah,
time of
so
day where you?
grouse, they peak. So the most of their drumming does peak in the morning, right around sunrise or shortly after sunrise. They will drum at any time of day. So like I've heard grouse drum in the middle of the day and in the evening, but as far as the peak of that activity, it's definitely in the morning. And then woodcock are kind of the opposite. So they actually peak that display in the evening time. In the evening hours right before sunset is when that peaks. So yeah, for the surveys, it's kind of nice because in the springtime you can survey in the morning for grouse and you can survey in the evening for woodcock. Well, I appreciate your attention. It's a good group.
No, I think it was great. I motivated to go out in the cold and listen for the woodcock in a couple of months. We still got a couple of months.
Yeah, so about mid-April for both of them is when you'll be able to start hearing them. I know last year we started seeing woodcock sightings in February. They returned. But mid-April, later in April is really when it'll peak. So that's when I would definitely go out and try to hear both of these awesome birds.
With the woodcock, are you starting to look at eBird or just with the grouse?
Yeah, so I didn't show that here, but I think through eBird and then a little bit of the Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative, Cornell has that migratory tracker tool that they developed. I think it's through the Lab of Ornithology. But now you can use that tool to kind of track when woodcock migration peaks in different places and also the abundance. I think that's the eBird side of things. So yeah, using a couple of different data sources like eBird and then what we've learned about migration, you can look at woodcock abundance during the breeding season and migration in different areas and when you would expect peak woodcock abundance to occur in your area during the spring and during the fall migration. So they're really cool tools that will only improve as we gather more data about them. So, oh my gosh, first of the season woodcock sighting on January 28th. Yeah. Yeah, and you said you saw males during the CBC in December, and I was getting reports of woodcock still hanging around in December. It's one of those things that, they rely on getting into the ground for food. So as long as the ground isn't frozen and they're able to access food resources, they can stick around. It's really once that ground freezes or, bad winter weather happens that they have to kind of get out of Dodge, but they do stick around if they can. Oh wow, up in Canaan. That's really interesting because that's a pretty high elevation place. I'm just reading the comments if anybody's able to see those. So
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't see any more comments, and I really thank you very much for taking your time to talk to us tonight. I think a lot of people really enjoyed it. I know that I did.
thank you
So,
for having me. I appreciate it.
okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Reina.
No problem. It's a lot of stuff.
That was, yeah.
Every time I give it, I'm like, I really got to cut stuff out, but there's just too much to talk about.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
all
You go ahead, Lee J.
it was all good. Yeah. And I've said Bruce earlier, but I meant Eric Bloomberg. And
Okay, I thought that's who you might.
we're-
Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke wrong, but it's kind of neat, Bruce Barlow too.
Mm-hmm. It's a
Yeah.
small world.
Small
Yeah.
world. Yeah. All
Well,
right.
thank you. Hope to cross paths with you sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me. Adios.
Bye-bye, everybody.